Standby cassette, standby.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. Harold Holt.
You're a nobody till somebody loves you. You're a nobody till somebody cares. You may be king, you may possess the world and its gold, but gold won't bring you happiness when you're growing old.
This is David Johnson reporting from Portsea. Australia's Prime Minister, Mr. Harold Holt, is missing. At 12 o'clock today, he went for a swim on the ocean side of Portsea Beach.
Officials are still clinging to a hope that Mr. Holt may still be found alive, but they admit their hopes are fading with every minute that goes by.
It was Sunday, December the 17th, 1967. With his country at war in Vietnam, the Australian Prime Minister, Harold Holt, went missing.
The Prime Minister disappears without trace. This is unparalleled in the modern history of Western democracy.
They said it was a case of accidental drowning, an all too common Australian tragedy. But many people remained unconvinced. This is the story of the Prime Minister's secret world in the months before he disappeared. A world of betrayal, political treachery, and mounting physical and mental strain. A world concealed by others and never investigated.
This was softly. The protocol in those days is how far a policeman was allowed to go without stepping on someone's toes.
But the Prime Minister left behind tantalising clues that day. Clues which challenged the official explanation for his disappearance.
He was a decent man. That's why I feel angry at the unspeakable bastards who were plotting his defeat at the time of his death.
The drama began a little past noon.
I can't actually quite remember what I was thinking. I mean, I just was absolutely shattered and a little scared. When I was driving along the fairly narrow road, and I was driving, I have to say, reasonably fast, and I overtook a car very excessively, and they must have thought, crikey, what's going on here?
Hold on. Get me a commanding officer, please.
Who are you?
Stewart, Alan Stewart. The Prime Minister's in trouble.
I wanted to speak to the duty officer because I'd seen helicopters down there at some stage, and I thought there just might be a helicopter there, and that would be an absolute godsend.
I had a call from the political correspondent for the Melbourne Sun, and he rang me to say that there was a report of a VIP missing in the sea at Portsea.
I was under the shower, draped the towel around myself a bit, came out to the hall where the telephone was. And I said, "What do you want, Hildebrand?" He said, "The Prime Minister has gone for a swim. He's gone out and he can't be found. And the Chief Commissioner says you ought to go and take charge of the search." And I said, "Stop bulldusting, Hildebrand. What's the matter?"
Wild, deserted Cheviot Beach, 2 hours' drive from Melbourne, was Holt's favourite skin diving location. Throughout the afternoon, civilian, police and Navy divers risked their own lives in search of the Prime Minister.
The water was so murky, so turbulent, the undertow was so great, they couldn't see anything, they couldn't get anywhere.
Suddenly, it was like a war zone. It was jammed with people and aircraft and boats and everything.
Unprecedented in Australian history that so much effort should be invested in finding one person.
Looking at the state of the water, it was pretty turbulent, and I was a bit surprised somebody would go swimming in that condition.
At 5 p.m, the Prime Minister's wife, Zara, flew into Melbourne from Canberra.
Lots of the people down on the beaches along Port Phillip Bay heard that Mrs. Holt was heading down to Portsea, and they'd come out and stood on the side of the road, stood sort of heads bowed, quietly, just standing there, wanting to pay their respects to Mrs. Holt.
Mrs. Holt went straight to the family holiday home at Portsea to wait for news. Meanwhile, the couple's sons joined the hundreds of rescuers at the beach. It had been 6 hours since the Prime Minister was reported missing, and the weather was deteriorating.
I didn't give up hope. I didn't sort of accept the fact that he was gone. We hoped that he'd turn up on a beach 4 miles down, washed away somewhere or something.
An extensive search has been in operation since approximately 2 o'clock today. Up until the present time, of course, we've found no trace of our Prime Minister.
No, he certainly was not wearing flippers or wetsuit or anything of that kind. He was just going for a swim.
There was only one person with the Prime Minister?
There was only one person in the water with the Prime Minister.
My thoughts about somebody finding a person alive after that time were pretty slim. I thought, well, there's a chance, but it's negligible, unless he's been cast up on the shore somewhere. We were now looking for a corpse.
It was beyond comprehension that the nation's leader could simply vanish. Was it a simple accident? Why did he enter the wild surf that day? Was there anything in the Prime Minister's personal or political life to explain his disappearance? For 3 decades, Harold Holt had been a hard-working Liberal parliamentarian. As a loyal treasurer, he was anointed successor to the long-serving Prime Minister, Robert Menzies. When Menzies retired on Australia Day in 1966, Holt was elected unopposed as the nation's 17th Prime Minister.
He got there without having to walk over dead bodies, so to speak. You know, he was a very affable man, and he saw that, I guess, as his strength.
I'll see you on Monday.
But some wondered if he was ready for it, and some also were concerned that he'd been too long in Menzies' shadow. Well, after 30 years in Parliament, now is Harold's chance.
As Holt came to power, Australia was transforming socially and economically. The dollar replaced the pound, and Japan replaced Britain as the country's major trading partner. The Holt government ushered in greater racial tolerance, winding back the White Australia policy, and agreeing to a referendum that would see Aboriginal Australians counted as citizens in the census. His defining foreign policy decision was to bring Australia even closer to the United States by trebling the nation's troop commitment to the Vietnam War.
A staunch friend that will be all the way with LBJ.
The Right Honourable Harold Holt.
After only 10 months in office, Holt converted public support for the war into votes, winning a landslide election victory and becoming the most popular leader the country had seen, and the most accessible.
He was the first Prime Minister that had to deal with electronic media. He had cameras always being pushed in his face.
I think Holt certainly projected the image of somebody who was with it and part of the swinging 60s.
Australia doesn't have enough people. All the more reason for us to be fit people.
He was about image, he was about front, he was about public relations.
If more people paid as much attention to looking after their body as they do their motor cars, they would feel a whole lot better. and enjoy life a lot more.
Portsea on Victoria's Mornington Peninsula. There, far from the pressures of political life, Mr. and Mrs. Holt can spend their weekends at their favourite sport, spearfishing. In Mr. Holt's own words, this never-ending silent world is pleasing for a politician.
The great mystery for Australians was how their fit 59-year-old Prime Minister could be lost in the environment he loved best.
When he was first introduced to skin diving, he thought it was a whole new world, and he felt it separated him from everything else in the world. Even to the point he'd sit in Parliament and hold his breath to try and see that he could extend his range underwater.
The international media fawned over Holt, dubbing him the 007 Prime Minister.
There's a sense in which, hey, you want to be like this guy, you're attracted to him. The trouble is, though, that he believes some of his own propaganda.
News stories from all around the world are arriving here containing words of shock, disbelief, and a hope for a miracle.
President and Mrs. Johnson are staying in very close touch with the situation through the American Embassy in Canberra.
The Queen has said she wishes to be kept closely informed as the massive search in Australia continues.
The next day, my brothers and I went with my mother to the beach. She wanted to thank the team that was searching, the army and the police people, navy people. She was really very courageous about the whole thing.
On the second day, the mystery deepened when the police made an astonishing admission. There had been 4 people on the beach with the Prime Minister, not one as previously reported. If it was a simple case of accidental death, why were the police withholding crucial facts? Travelling with Harold Holt was his Portsea neighbour, Mrs. Marjorie Gillespie. In a second car, driven by Alan Stewart, were Mrs. Gillespie's 20-year-old daughter, Vina, and her 19-year-old boyfriend, Martin Simpson.
This is a record of interview with Mrs. Marjorie Gillespie.
Until the Prime Minister's body could be recovered, homicide detectives hoped these witnesses would provide an explanation for his disappearance.
Mrs. Gillespie, how long have you known the Prime Minister?
My husband and I have known the Holts for about 6 or 7 years. They purchased part of our estate for their holiday retreat.
And how did you come to be with the Prime Minister on Sunday?
Prime Minister telephoned and said he was going down to the Old Fort to watch the around-the-world sailor Alec Rose sail through the Heads, and asked if we'd like to go along.
Mrs. Gillespie, how would you describe his demeanour?
He appeared happy and in good spirits the whole time.
At the Prime Minister's suggestion, the party then travelled a short distance to the unpredictable ocean beach at Cheviot for a swim. It was a surprising decision. A more sheltered beach nearby was closed due to the blustery conditions.
And it was quite an incredible sight. It was also a very hot day, extremely hot day. The wind was a westerly, I think, which accounted for the surfing. Pretty wild.
Vina Gillespie and myself walked off along the beach with our backs to everything that subsequently went on.
Is it normally like this? Don't worry. I know this beach like the back of my hand.
And then Mr. Holt decided he was going to have a dip to cool off.
Well, if Mr. Holt can take it, I think I'll go in too.
Good luck.
And I walked in and I felt the most incredible undertow. And it was just incredibly powerful and really scary actually. And just suddenly the surf just went absolutely berserk. It just suddenly built up into an absolute crescendo. It all just happened just so spectacularly and dreadfully.
Does he usually swim this long?
No, never. I can't see him.
I didn't ever see Mr. Holt again.
I was confident that the people around the beach were pretty reliable witnesses. I really accepted quite completely their version of what had occurred.
It was very rare for me to be with a Prime Minister. It's the only time I've ever been with one. And for him then to disappear was surrealistic to me.
Over the coming weeks, detectives interviewed more than 50 people, including the Prime Minister's local spearfishing friends. No one could understand why he risked his life in such treacherous surf. Once the initial shock subsided, attention turned to the political implications of the Prime Minister's presumed death. The events that followed in Canberra rivaled in intrigue the disappearance itself.
If it is true that leadership abhors a vacuum, there were many people who were willing to fill it, and particularly those who were driven by their own personal ambitions.
The obvious candidate to replace Holt was the urbane and wealthy treasurer, William McMahon.
There's nothing I can say that's not already known.
Mr. McMahon, what is the constitutional position should the Prime Minister's body not be found?
Well, you contest the leadership.
Thank you, gentlemen.
I think Billy McMahon had his first ambitions the day after he was born, actually. Billy McMahon always wanted to be Prime Minister of Australia. I'm certain of that in my own mind.
But there were two parties in the coalition government. The Deputy Prime Minister, John Blackjack McEwen, was the minority Country Party leader. A shrewd political fighter from the land, he was determined to stall McMahon's push for the Prime Ministership.
Mr. Holt was a personal friend of yours, Mr. McEwen.
He was a very intimate personal friend of mine. We both entered Parliament just a year apart. We were very close friends indeed.
The Governor-General supported McEwen's brazen delaying strategy. 48 hours after Holt's disappearance, he swore in McEwen as interim Prime Minister.
For my part, gentlemen, I achieved this high office with no sense of personal gratification. It is my intention to hold the office until the major party in the coalition, the Liberal Party, has chosen for itself a new leader.
McEwen then dropped a political bombshell.
There are rumours that you will not accept Mr. McMahon as leader of the Liberal Party.
Yes, I have told Mr. McMahon that neither I nor my Country Party colleagues will be prepared to serve under him as Prime Minister.
Will you disclose the reasons?
No, I will not. Mr. McMahon knows the reasons. My senior Liberal colleagues not only know the reasons, but knew the reasons before Mr. Holt's death. If Mr. McMahon were to be elected, it would create a serious national crisis.
This is an extraordinary way for a partnership to be played out, and it had direct and immediate effects for the country, because it's probable that McMahon would have gone close to having the numbers, and yet here was McEwen saying, well, let me tell you this, you're not being Prime Minister.
It was a sign that something was seriously amiss within the coalition government. But neither man was prepared to reveal the source of the problem. let alone if it could have impacted on Holt's disappearance. "18 days after the Prime Minister went missing, the largest sea, air and land search in Australia's history was abandoned. No body or evidence of any kind had been found. The official police report released soon after left no uncertainty. Harold Holt had accidentally drowned. But over time, persistent doubts about the finding fueled rumour and wild speculation. It was the height of Cold War paranoia, and civil unrest over the Vietnam War was on the rise.
There've been a lot of conspiracy theories about it, and all sorts of ideas about who might or who might not want to see him out of the way. Of course, you can never really account for a lunatic that might have wanted to shoot him.
The previous year, the leader of the Labour opposition, Arthur Calwell, had survived an assassination attempt. The culprit was a student opposed to his anti-war stance. There was evidence, too, that Harold Holt may have been the target of an assassin.
One day, the police found what appeared to be a bullet hole in one of the windows of the Prime Minister's office. I don't think, from what I remember, the Prime Minister or anyone at the time knew when it happened. There was no knowledge that someone had taken a shot. Subsequently, it was recommended that at night, the Prime Minister working in his office should not just sit there with the blinds up, but he should draw the blinds and draw the curtains.
The police had investigated the possibility of murder. Forensic detectives had scoured the beach as if it were a crime scene. And the 4 eyewitnesses were taken back to reenact the events.
They wanted to know, had he eaten or drunk anything, I guess, because the possibility of poisoning. They wanted to know if we'd seen anyone else around, if we'd heard anything. I never saw any evidence or heard any evidence or had any inkling that there would be anyone else there.
We searched the beach for weapons or something unusual, like some spear guns, anything. We were able to come up with nothing in the forensic side of it that contributed to Mr. Holt's disappearance.
The most bizarre theory, announced in a blaze of publicity, suggested the Prime Minister did not enter the surf merely for a swim, but to flee his country.
The initial Australian print run for The Prime Minister Was a Spy was 70,000 copies, and obviously the publishers, Hodder and Stoughton, thought they had a hit on their hands.
Anthony Gray, a British novelist, alleges that Holt had been a spy for the Chinese for more than 30 years, and that finally it had got too hot, he was too close to being discovered, so he wades into the water and there's a Chinese submarine off the coast to whisk him off to Beijing.
That is the most preposterous, ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. A submarine in that surf would have been beached in no time. It just is absolutely inconceivable.
It's a joke that's part of the folklore. We know it's not true, but how absurd. How totally absurd. The whole thing was absurd.
Conspiracy theories persisted, but then in 1985 came a stunning confession.
I was 19, I understood nothing. But they were clearly close friends. They had an easy friendship, an understanding between one another whenever I saw them together.
It wasn't really till 20 years after he disappeared that Mrs. Gillespie said, well, I was Harold Holt's last lover, and that we had a relationship going at the time that he disappeared.
He was a womanizer. He loved them. He loved women. I felt like telling Marge about the other half dozen in the same position.
So you were under a lot more pressure at the time of his disappearance than anyone realised?
But I've been under that pressure for years. She wasn't the first, she's only one of a string. He was quite a dangerous chap to have around.
If the police failed to uncover Holt's relationship with Mrs. Gillespie, What other evidence had they overlooked?
This was softly. We were investigating the disappearance of the Prime Minister. The protocol in those days is how far a policeman was allowed to go without stepping on someone's toes.
The loss of a leader has consequences for a nation's political direction. Yet, surprisingly, police and intelligence agencies failed to investigate Harold Holt's political life. At Portsea, an hour before he disappeared, the Prime Minister received a telephone call from a colleague.
Yes, he's here.
His housekeeper noted the call in her
Can you hold
diary.
on a minute, please? Thanks.
He had a phone call and I answered the phone call, and it was Billy McMahon.
Yes. Did you contact him at all that morning?
No, I did not. And my wife will verify that because she continually said to me, Bill, you've got to get him. I didn't because of the quarrel I'd had with him in the week.
All right, Billy, if that's the way you want it, you can have it that way. That's that. That's it, Tiny. That's it.
Mr. McMahon says that he never made a phone call on that day.
Mr. McMahon did make one.
McMahon's denial hinted that party politics might indeed have played a role in the Prime Minister's disappearance. By mid-1967, the Vietnam War was dividing the country, and every soldier killed diminished public support for the government. As the year dragged on, Holt stumbled from crisis to crisis, culminating in a damaging allegation by the Labour Party, now led by Gough Whitlam. Parliamentarians' families, they claimed, were using government VIP aircraft for private travel, and passenger logs would prove it.
The problem with the VIP affair for the government was that they insisted there were no records kept. Whereas, in fact, I had a father who was in the Air Force who rang me in the Chief Government Whip's office and said, I'm sorry to interfere, but everybody in the Air Force is laughing at the government.
And the Prime Minister will answer charges made last Friday in the Senate that Parliament was deceived over these records, which, it transpired, did exist and have now been tabled in Parliament.
This is all a bit dodgy. And as Gough Whitlam rightly pointed out, if it's dodgy on this matter, how can we trust them on the big issues like Vietnam? It was a perfectly good point to make. I think Holt's capacity to lead the party was damaged by all those events during 1967. He proved to be indecisive. He proved not to be able to bash heads together, which is important in a Prime Minister. You've got to be ruthless, and Harold Holt was just too nice a man.
Despite his landslide victory less than a year earlier, Holt's popularity was plummeting. A month out from his disappearance, the government suffered a humiliating defeat at a half-Senate election. The media speculated that if the Prime Minister didn't lift his game, his government would lose the next federal election.
There's a lot of talk these days about the personality cult of leaders in politics, suggesting that it's not a matter of two parties against each other, but two leaders. Do you think this imposes a bigger strain on your husband?
No, he's got a good personality. It comes out easily. The only strain being imposed on him that's extra at the moment is they won't let him smile. And I think it's such a shame, because I love him smiling, but he tries very hard not to smile, and he's not that sort of man.
As well as the judgment of his party, Holt was the first Prime Minister to face the relentless scrutiny of current affairs television.
Supremely, what counts for me, I'm sure, is the trust and confidence my party colleagues have placed in me. After all, they elected me unanimously to lead them, and they haven't changed their verdict yet.
But many of Holt's colleagues had changed their verdict. The Prime Minister read of their discontent in a letter from the government chief whip, Dudley Irwin. He wrote that concern about his leadership had come from all levels of the party, and the situation was so serious it required his urgent attention. That letter was in Holt's briefcase the day he disappeared.
That briefcase contained a lot of bad news for Holt. And I think at the time of his death, he must have been pondering his own political future.
In the ensuing years, the Labour Party demanded to know what else was in Holt's possession that day. Those demands were never met. But now a more complete story can be told. Holt's briefcase contained evidence of a poisonous feud between the next two most powerful men in the coalition.
You are intentionally undermining our position on tariffs because you can't get your way in cabinet.
I deny that, John. I've only brought up tariff issues twice in the last 12 months.
Look, calm down, gentlemen. Please, calm down.
McEwen didn't believe McMahon could be trusted. He thought he was a liar, he was duplicitous, he'd do anything he could to advance his own cause, and he just simply said as a colleague, he's the worst you could possibly find.
The war preceded Holt's leadership, but unlike Menzies, Holt was never able to keep a lid on their mutual loathing. Menzies later quipped, Harold's weakness was his desire for everyone to love him. With the Prime Minister unable to rein in McMahon, McEwen persuaded Governor-General Lord Casey to intervene. A week before Holt went missing, Casey summoned McMahon to his official residence in Sydney.
I want to discuss some concerns I have, particularly your animosity toward Jack McEwen. What you are doing is rubbing off on the relationship between the Liberals and the Country Party, and frankly, it's to be deplored.
I doubt you have the constitutional authority to discuss this. If there is a perceived problem, it's the Prime Minister's responsibility.
The Governor-General's intervention is totally out of place and inconsistent with his role. I mean, he took the view the government was his government, and somehow he was, although the Queen's representative, he was analogous to the Queen and could act like he was the monarch.
Letters from both men, documenting the controversial encounter, were in the Prime Minister's briefcase the day he went missing.
When the Governor-General heard that Holt had disappeared, he immediately became alarmed. Where was the letter he'd written to Holt about McMahon? He then instructed the Commonwealth Police to go to the house at Portsea and seize anything that looked like it was an official document for the purpose of getting back this letter, which was political dynamite.
Holt's housekeeper witnessed the removal of documents from his briefcase.
It was up in his room, but there was somebody came and they got something out of it. They were tall, well-dressed men. They got out the window and went out the window.
But there was another set of even more explosive documents taken that day. Until now, they've been withheld to protect the national interest. They contain revelations of treachery, political blackmail, and ultimately, a plot against Prime Minister Harold Holt. They detail an investigation into the leaking of cabinet secrets to a political journalist, who was allegedly passing them to another country. Maxwell Newton, a brash and brilliant journalist, was the former editor of the Australian newspaper. He now published economic newsletters which regularly attacked Holt and McEwen while praising Treasurer William McMahon.
McEwen was outraged, I'm sure, at the viciousness and the hatred that permeated everything that Newton wrote.
More troubling than Newton's personal attacks was a rumour that he was supplying government secrets to Japan through its trade office in Sydney. McEwen told Holt this information was obviously being used to undermine Australia's trading position with Japan.
McEwen believed that Newton was an agent for the Japanese who would benefit by lowering the tariff, destroying Australian manufacturing industry so that the Japanese could increase their exports to Australia. So it was entirely appropriate, he believed, to prove his case.
The allegation was so serious, Australia's spy agency, ASIO, was called in to investigate Newton. ASIO set out to recruit Japanese trade staff, hoping to access correspondence with Newton. But their attempts failed. Meanwhile, McEwen's staff began their own secret investigation. Detailed transcripts were compiled of clandestine meetings with disgruntled associates and enemies of the journalist.
Newton's mad. He's the most dangerous journalist in Canberra. Not long ago, his backside was hanging outside of his pants. Now he's got 2 houses, 2 cars.
What about his association with the Japs?
They're paying Max for trade and tariff information.
How much?
20,000 a year.
20,000 for tariff information? What's worth that sort of money?
You work it out.
On the eve of a visit to Australia by the Prime Minister of Japan, McEwen summoned the Japanese ambassador, without informing his own Prime Minister. Transcripts of the meeting would remain classified for 4 decades.
I'm unaware of this, Mr. Newton.
Mr. Ambassador, he is promoting Japanese interests over Australian interests and using leaked cabinet information to achieve that end.
As I said, I'm unaware of this, Mr. Newton.
If Jetro continues this relationship, I can no longer be regarded a friend of the Japanese. I shall be informing our Prime Minister, Mr. Holt, of your response to this situation, particularly concerning Mr. Newton's contract.
No surprise that McEwen would resort to blackmail of the Japanese ambassador, because that's the whole modus operandi of his party. They blackmail everyone. They tried to blackmail the Liberal Party every time there had to be an adjustment to the exchange rate. That was the whole method of operation.
But McEwen's threats succeeded where ASIO's methods had failed. The ambassador provided a copy of Newton's contract with the Japanese trade organisation. In McEwen's mind, this was proof the journalist was an agent of a foreign power. One question remained. Who was supplying Newton with secret cabinet information? McEwen believed he had discovered the perpetrator. A regular visitor to Newton's Canberra home.
McMahon phones Newton every Sunday.
That doesn't prove anything.
From a public phone box?
The investigation was damning of McMahon, who McEwen had long believed wanted to end the coalition with his country party.
I'm surprised at the depth of it, and yet not surprised in another way. I think Mr. McEwen felt he was sort of fighting for his political life, so to speak.
Now, McEwen conveniently had ammunition to use against his political rival. But McEwen's covert investigation revealed that the Prime Minister, too, would soon be fighting for his political life.
I got an approach from Hooker, a land developer. He said he's drumming up support with certain people from the Bank of New South Wales and Max Newton to make a move.
Well, move to do what?
Replace Holt with a certain New South Wales minister.
New South Wales.
But basically what McEwen is telling Holt is, you've got to get rid of McMahon. That if he got rid of the leading New South Wales Liberal as Treasurer,
and put in someone who was congenial to McEwen, the new power of the Liberal Party, the New South Wales Liberal Party, would be against him. He was in a no-win position. The man must have had immense worry. I don't know how he would have solved it if he'd lived.
Only days before his disappearance, Holt finally asserted his leadership. He accused both McMahon and McEwen of destabilising the coalition, and even threatened to govern without McEwen's Country Party.
I think the events of the last week were such that he had finally made up his mind that things had to change.
Leaving Parliament House for the last time, Holt must have known his hold on power was tenuous. His briefcase contained confronting letters about his failures. It was all a far cry from the highs of his election victory only a year earlier. His last words to a senior public servant were, "Man wasn't made to live like this."
It's inevitable that someone would say, oh, Harold's taken his own life. 1967 had been bad, there are fractures in the coalition, it's all downhill from here, why go on living? He'd got to the pinnacle, why go out in an ignominious fashion, just walk into the sea, there's enough doubt to make people think it was an accident. Harold committed suicide. There's no evidence for it.
I thought if this were something, the Prime Minister's way out of a difficult situation, then it was a most bizarre way of doing it.
I've never believed that for a moment. It always seemed to me that notwithstanding all the pressures on him during 1967, the key thing to remember about Holt is that he was a life affirmer.
It had been a long year, it had been a disappointing year. He just did what many Australians want to do, go and have a quiet weekend by yourself near the water. That's really all he wanted.
For Harold Holt, the sea was an antidote to the stress of political life. But throughout 1967, as those stresses escalated, his fitness deteriorated, and he began to overestimate his abilities.
He would stay in for hours. He was fascinated by it. He was, I think, foolhardy. His courage exceeded his wisdom.
At Cheviot Beach, 7 months before he disappeared, the Prime Minister had to be helped to shore, vomiting and hyperventilating. He admitted coming close to drowning. Three months later, while celebrating his 59th birthday with television celebrity Bob Dyer, Holt had to be rescued.
There's a crisis. The PM splutters. Bring the dinghy quickly. I hop in and paddle like mad.
Prophetically, he told Dyer, "If you've got to go, you've got to go. And this would be the way to go." The police were told of these near-death experiences. They questioned his Canberra doctor, who said there was no physical or mental impairment that could have contributed to his disappearance. Evidence has since come to light, which contradicts that opinion.
The last time I'd been in to have a haircut, he said to me, "Oh, the boss was in earlier this week." I said, "How was he?" And he said, "He's complaining about his shoulder, and he's got no feeling in his fingertips of his right hand."
The cause of Holt's pain was first revealed in the 1980s by his Melbourne orthopaedic surgeon, John Cloke.
It showed that he had one of the intervertebral discs was narrowed down to probably less than half of its normal width. This was producing pain down the arm, numbness in the middle fingers, and also considerable weakness of the right upper limb.
The day before Holt disappeared, a newspaper reported his injury. His specialist, it said, had advised him to cut down on tennis and swimming.
crazy thing is, on Saturday he played tennis and on Sunday he got into the water. It was still giving him pain. He couldn't use it to the full extent that he would have liked. The trouble was, he was like many Australian men, ignore the doctor, I'm invincible, I'll do whatever I like.
Holt's Portsea friends informed police about his Melbourne surgeon, but he wasn't interviewed. He could have told them he'd prescribed the Prime Minister a powerful and highly addictive opiate for his pain.
He had a bottle of morphine and aspirin mixture in his pocket most of the time.
Enough to kill the pain?
Well, to some extent, enough to make him happier with it.
And there was one occasion when he took more of that medication than I think was desirable. We were flying from Canberra or Melbourne to a political meeting in Perth, so it's a long flight, and he took some of these pills. I noticed that when we got off the flight, he was a bit unsteady, actually. One might have thought he'd been drinking. He was just a little unsteady.
Both of the Prime Minister's doctors have since died, and their records destroyed. There is no evidence to suggest Holt's Canberra doctor knew about his use of morphine.
If he knew that someone else was prescribing a medication and he hadn't, then I think he would have, by nature, he wouldn't have been backward in contacting that doctor and discussing why this was happening. Would he have advised him to stop using them? Yes. Remember, you're talking to a Prime Minister, though, and you can give him advice, but then whether he's going to follow it's another question, and what can you do?
On December the 17th, 1967, Harold Holt, the life affirmer, ignored his doctor's orders for the second time that weekend. To escape the stresses of politics, he again sought sanctuary in the silent world he cherished. It was a fateful decision. Some say it was simply recklessness or bravado. But evidence suggests it was a decision more likely made under great strain and the influence of his medication.
The fact that you've got morphine on board may have affected your decision making to actually go into the activity and what to do when you're in there, when to pull back. But I think crucially, you'd be able to undertake an activity without feeling that pain barrier. And so you might be in a situation where you could take on something thinking, oh, everything's working fine. And then just suddenly realise in the middle of it that the strength's not there.
Was the Prime Minister in good control in the water?
He did have a shoulder disability, and that prevented him from doing overarm while swimming. He appeared to be using his arms under the water.
Breaststroke?
Yeah. Well, I did see his arms occasionally.
Did you see him at this point?
Yes. That's when I kept saying, come back, come back. I knew he couldn't hear me. I think he was at the stage where he was trying to come back. But at that stage, I think he couldn't come back because the water just boiled up around him.
As far as I know, there was no investigation made into his medication and any inspection of his home for medication that would have contributed to his mental condition at the time he went into that surf. And now that I think of that, it is quite really shocking in one way, very surprising.
To my knowledge, the police did not come to Parliament House and ask any of his colleagues about his mental state. The coming together of those things, the tiredness, the problems, and the taking of drugs like morphine, might well have caused an error of judgment.
If it is so that he was taking medication that was at all out of the ordinary, that was not well known at all, and I certainly haven't heard of it before.
Are you surprised that
the evidence in relation to his physical condition hasn't come out?
No, it was very much suppressed, I think.
Do you regard it as a vital piece of evidence in terms of his disappearance?
I've always thought it was. That's why I kept his x-rays.
In the 1960s, there could be no coronial inquest without a body. In 2003, after a change in the law, the Victorian coroner revisited the Holt case, along with scores of other drownings along the same stretch of coast. The coroner backed the original police conclusion that it was simply an accident. No evidence concerning the Prime Minister's medical history, medication, or political situation was presented.
We want to be assured that if for some reason anything does happen to one of our chief political figures, that we get to the bottom of it, and that we've got confidence that our authorities will get to the bottom of it, because it affects us as a democracy.
At short notice, national leaders from around the world travelled great distances to Australia to attend the memorial service. Among the first to arrive was President Johnson of the United States of America, who had come, he said, to pay tribute to a friend.
President Marcos of the Philippines said Harold Holt was the father of the new Society of Asian Nations. He died as he lived adventurously and courageously, he said.
We are gathered here today to remember before Almighty God our late Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Harold Edward Holt. We mourn today for a man who loved Australia, who lived for Australia, who gave his best for Australia.
At Harold Holt's memorial service, there was as much talk and lobbying for leadership positions at that as there were tributes being paid, and that was sickening. It was one of the most sickening public services I've ever been to. He was a decent man. That's why I feel angry at the unspeakable bastards who were plotting his defeat at the time of his death.
In Holt's last days, political treachery and infighting had undermined his leadership. In the wake of his tragic death, those involved stepped up their war for control of the nation's political destiny.
But I have told Mr McMahon that neither I nor my Country Party colleagues would be prepared to serve under him as Prime Minister.
Newton's contract.
The evening John McEwen was sworn in as interim Prime Minister, he met with the chief of the spy agency, ASIO, to discuss McMahon's relationship with Maxwell Newton. 2 days later, ASIO agents broke into McMahon's home, looking for incriminating evidence. On the eve of the ballot to elect a new Prime Minister, the Australian newspaper alleged McMahon was associated with a foreign agent, Maxwell Newton. McMahon did not contest the ballot, but remained deputy leader under new Prime Minister John Gorton. By 1971, Gorton had suffered too many scandals of his own making. Within weeks of McEwen's retirement, McMahon, the master intriguer, finally realised his lifelong ambition to become Prime Minister. But with too many enemies and his party disunited, McMahon's government suffered electoral defeat the following year at the hands of an invigorated Labour Party.
In terms of a sequence of events, the death of Harold Holt made all of Australian history different. Some people who you'd never would have heard of again came to prominence, some who came to prominence then faded away. It was a real turning point between the old Australia, I think, and the new. Different kind of politics, different kind of politicians. And Harold, I think, is the point around which much of that turns.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. Harold Holt.
You're a nobody till somebody loves you. You're a nobody till somebody cares. You may be king, you may possess the world, and it's gold. But gold won't bring you happiness when you're growing old. The world still is the same, you'll never change it. As sure as the stars shine above, you're nobody till somebody loves you. So find yourself somebody to